Hello, everyone. I'm Curtis Ennis, Director of Education for the Halton District School Board. On behalf of the Halton District School Board, we want to thank you for joining us for this budget planning information session. We especially want to thank you, our staff, students, families, and members of the broader community for providing us with insightful questions around the HDSB's important budgeting process. Your participation is essential to creating a quality educational system. Public input is critically important to the HDSB in all that we do, and following this session, an opportunity to provide input that will guide decision making will be shared. Implementing the objectives in our multi year strategic plan is always at the forefront of everything we do in the HDSB, and that includes when we draft our yearly budget. We believe the HDSB is at its strongest and most effective when we work together for student success and positive learning outcomes. Creating a budget for the board is among the most important responsibilities we undertake each year. Through this process, our goal is to create a vibrant and engaging educational system designed to address student learning, achievement, and well being. Now, I'd like to introduce Roxana Nagoy, Superintendent of Business Services, who is going to explain the budget development process, answer the questions you've submitted, and provide information about how the HDSB is funded, how resources are allocated, and how you can continue to provide feedback throughout the process.
Thank you, Director Ennis, and thank you all for tuning in to the public information session on the HDSB budgeting process. It is my pleasure to provide you with an overview of the budget process and the provincial landscape that impacts funding for the education sector, as well as a brief overview of how the Halton District School Board is funded and how we allocate our limited resources. Following the presentation, I will answer questions we have received from the public. It is our hope that this information will assist you in filling out the budget survey, which we will launch tomorrow. We look forward to hearing what are the areas of priority and challenges, as well as how we can better allocate resources to support our strategic commitments and meet the needs for all of our students. The budget development process is rooted in supporting our 6 strategic commitments, which are listed in the 2024-2028 multi-year strategic plan. In order to allocate our limited resources efficiently and to maximize the support to our students and staff, the budget process requires a deep understanding of the external and internal environments, the regulatory compliance and enveloping limitations, identifying areas of risk that may impact our ability to deliver our strategic commitments, and understanding our data trends to inform our decisions. To further support the implementation of the multi-year strategic plan commitments, resource allocation is aligned with the annual operating plan, both at the board and school level, the capital plan, and the special education plan, all of which are developed and approved at the same time with the budget development process. On this next slide, we're going to go through the budget development process and the key dates. The budget development process starts in the fall of the prior year with a lot of meetings with the senior staff that are developing the budget objectives for the following year, as well as the budget timelines. These were presented to the Board of Trustees on December the 3rd. All the reports and presentations are going to be available on our budget and information website. Through January and February, we conduct a number of feedback consultation sessions. They are both one-on-one and group settings, as well as a budget survey, which we will be launching tomorrow. We collect this information and review it before making decisions with regards to resource allocation. Feedback consultation results will be presented at the March 4th board meeting. And following that, there will be a number of presentations at the Committee of the Whole discussing various aspects of the budget planning. In June, we present the draft report to the Board of Trustees on June 3rd, and then for board approval on June 17th. As I mentioned before, we are going to be opening the budget survey from January 21st, and it will stay open until February the 9th. We're going to continue with our staff budget sessions Special Education Advisory Committee budget input, and the Parent Involvement Committee budget sessions. The trustees will participate in budget workshops between February and May, and we will be presenting at the March meeting the stakeholder feedback to the Board of Trustees as well. It is important to understand the provincial landscape. The Government of Ontario provides the sector with funding alongside other public sectors. The education is the second largest component of the provincial budget, with over $30 billion to date. When it was announced, the education sector for core education funding received $28.6 billion provincially, with additional funding that was announced for the year, in particularly as labor agreements were ratified. In addition to that, there are supports for student needs that are provided in the form of responsive education programs that are one-time funding, and they are on an annual basis announced and are not as flexible. They have to be spent for the purpose for which they are intended. All in all, to date, the education sector received over $30 billion provincially. In the economic outlook, the province has announced that it plans to eliminate the current deficit by the year 2026-2027. That means it plans to eliminate $6.6 billion deficit that we have in the current year within 2 years. And that means they are planning to keep costs down and provide austerity measures to all the public sectors, including the education sector, while absorbing inflation costs that are increasing, an increasing economy and growth of the province, and higher negotiated labor costs. Education sector funding has not kept up with all the increases in cost that we've seen over the number of years. This slide outlines some of the areas that not only our school board, but school boards across the province face. Inflation and market cost pressures have escalated over the last few years. There are some education funding parameters for learning resources and technology that have not been updated since 2008. That considerably increases our pressure when we're looking at the buying power for those budgets. The core education funding has also not kept up with the cost of providing a replacement for sick leave. The sick leave provisions are negotiated centrally and have been exceeding the funding for the last number of years by as much as 60%. In addition, benefit costs have increased through the federally mandated enhancements to CPP and EI contributions, which impact both the employee as well as the employer's share. And these did not have an offsetting revenue. Special education funding model has not kept up with costs and the increase in students with exceptionalities. It is based on the overall enrollment of a school for the most part, and data that is dated at this point in time. The new transportation funding allocation has also changed over the last 2 years and resulted in a reduction to most school boards, including to the Halton District School Board. Other areas of the sector that are exceeding, or the costs are exceeding the revenues, include student and staff mental health and the temporary accommodations for those schools that are overutilization. As I've mentioned, over the last few years, funding for the HDSB has not kept up with costs. We have experienced challenges similar to other Ontario school boards. To advocate for fair funding, for the Halton students, the HDSB trustees have been raising concerns about the education funding with the Government of Ontario and the local members of provincial parliament. As a key partner in public education, parents can join the HDSB trustees in advocating for an improved funding formula. For more information and suggestions on how to advocate about your concerns with education funding in Halton, visit hdsb.ca and search fair funding. Moving from the provincial perspective to a board perspective, it is important to notice that the landscape has changed in Halton. Over the last few years, Halton has been known as a growth board. We are currently expected to have a decline in student enrollment in both elementary and secondary panels, and enrollment is the main driver of our funding. We are also looking at the interest rates that are expected to decline, which will decrease our interest revenue. And we are using this additional expense and additional revenue to complement our budget and the areas of funding which are not keeping up with the costs. In addition, the high inflation is continuing to increase up our operating costs as well as our contractual obligations without the same increase in revenue. And while we do have declining enrollment overall as a school board, we have areas of growth, and namely in Southeast Milton and Northeast Oakville, where we are still building new schools. We have a secondary school that is currently being planned for in Northeast Oakville. We are opening a new school in Northeast Oakville for an elementary panel in September, and we are continuing to build an additional elementary school in Milton as well as in Oakville. Currently, our budget has a $1.8 million deficit. This is a one-time deficit. We are using accumulating surplus in order to invest in one-time items that have been approved by both the board and the Ministry of Education. We are required by regulation to eliminate this deficit in the current year and have a balanced budget in 2025-2026. The next few slides are going to go over the key budget components: enrollment, which is our main driver for funding; revenues, where we'll discuss how school boards are funded and how HDSB receives its funding; and expenses, how do we spend the funding. As I've mentioned before, we are expecting to see an enrollment decline in both panels. The top part of this chart compares the projection for 2025-2026 to the current revised estimates, which contain the October 31st count date for students. And in looking at that, we are expecting to see a decline of over 500 students in the elementary panel and over 700 students in the secondary panel. So this enrollment history and projection chart for the elementary panel shows that over the next 3 years, we are looking at a decline in elementary students before we are starting to see a bit of an uptick. From a secondary perspective, that decline will go over the 4-year projection that we are reviewing and sharing with the Ministry of Education for the purposes of forecasting data and determining grant levels. So how do we get our funding? We have 2 slides for revenue. This first one is more of a visual slide, a pie chart that shows you the main categories of funding, the main one being the provincial grants from the Ministry of Education, as well as some of the other revenues. I'm going to move to the next slide and explain a little bit how school boards are funded, which provides a little bit more detail about these categories. School boards receive the majority of their funding, sometimes between 80 and 90%, from the province of Ontario through the Ministry of Education, through what is called core education funding or core ed. Core education funding is mainly driven by enrollment, the student enrollment for each school board, but also it has a lot of other parameters and data, such as social demographic factors of a region, the number of schools, the size of the schools, the condition of the school buildings, the number of students with exceptionalities, and a lot of other factors. In addition to the core education funding, which for our school board, it provides 85% of our overall funding, there are a number of other provincial grants through responsive education programs or REPs, which are one-time funding and they're determined on an annual basis. School boards also have a number of other revenue sources. Some come from other ministries or the federal government. These are typically for programs for language and skill training for adults. School-generated funds are funds at the school level. They belong to each school. They have a separate school bank account, and they're mainly funds that are generated through school fundraising and have very restricted guidelines on what they can be spent on. Investment income for our school board represents 0.3% of our overall revenue. And it is based on the cash balance and the timing between when we receive our payment from the Ministry of Education to when our expenses are disbursed. Other fees and revenues include international student tuition fees, rental income for our community use of schools, and education development charges, which are levies that we collect from municipalities for new development. This revenue in particular assists school boards to purchase new school sites for areas of growth. In our case, South Milton and North Oakville. Last but not least, the amortization of deferred capital contribution, which form over 4%, just over 4% of our revenues, is a form of revenue that offsets the non-cash expense of depreciating our fixed assets, such as our school buildings. The next couple of slides outline how we spend the money. We are an education service institution, and as such, we spend 98% of our revenues or our budget on instruction directly and indirectly. And I will explain a little bit more what I mean by that. So this slide provides a little bit more detail or a breakdown of the ministry categories for expenses that we are required and mandated to report upon. Instruction is a direct cost for classroom teachers and support staff in the classroom and in our schools, as well as learning resources, technology, staff development, all the things that we need and support to support our schools and our students. So that's what we call direct instructional costs. The indirect instructional costs include student transportation, getting our students to school so they can learn, which is 2.3% of our overall budget. Pupil accommodation, which is also our school operations and maintenance. So it's the maintenance, cleaning of our schools, school grounds, and ensuring the students have a clean and safe learning environment. It also includes school renewal and that interest expense for the work that is being done on our school buildings. The other expenses are also supporting directly or indirectly our students. Responsive education programs are those other ministry funds which have very specific targeted outcomes and specific guidelines on how we spend the money on priorities that are set up by the ministry. School-generated funds are the fundraising funds that are helping and then complement the experience of students through co-curricular and extracurricular activities. So all in all, directly and indirectly, we spend almost 98% of our budget on instruction. The board administration represents 2.2%, and it's important to understand that this includes a number of support functions that help and work with our schools, such as finance, purchasing, human resources, payroll, IT, school operations, facility management, communications, research and development. It also covers costs for software licensing, legal costs for the entire board, as well as the maintenance of the corporate office. The HDSB has always been diligent and has underspent the allocation for school board administration, with the balance helping complement our instructional costs. So looking forward for 2025-2026 and balancing the budget, I would like to first start off by saying that the budget planning for next year is a cautious but optimistic approach. And what I mean by that is that we are not expecting to have to make significant reductions, but we do have to contain costs and look at reallocating existing funds in order to meet our system priorities. In 2023-2024, the structural deficit was eliminated. The structural deficit had to be eliminated in the following year, and we had a $7.7 million structural deficit. So the planning for the current school year, 2024-2025, was a very difficult one. We had to eliminate over $10 million and 94 positions, align our budget allocation to funding, find efficiencies and restraints in order to be able to contain the costs for the future. We did receive board and ministry approval to continue to have a 1.8 million deficit for one-time investments in the system using our accumulated surplus. As I've mentioned before, by regulation, we're required to eliminate this deficit and develop a balanced budget for 2025-2026. While we know we cannot bring back what we have reduced in the current year, we are hopeful that we don't have to make significant reductions to balance the budget next year. The next steps in the budget process are to continue our discussions with various stakeholder groups, collect the information to help us with the development of the budget and making decisions. The budget survey will open on January 21st and will be open till February the 9th. We will be presenting the results of the survey and the feedback consultation that we received from various groups at the March 4th Board of Trustees meeting. Discussions and budget workshops will continue. They are public and they will be provided on the website between February and April. A draft budget will be presented to the Committee of the Whole in May, and the final report for the budget will be approved in June. We have a number of questions that we received from the public, which we will be addressing next. The first question: can you explain the funding formula from the ministry and how enrollment impacts the total funds received? Education funding is provided by the Government of Ontario to school boards through core education funding, which is primarily based on student enrollment. While student enrollment is the main factor, other elements also play a role in determining funding, such as demographic and socioeconomic data for the region, census data, the number of students with exceptionalities, the condition and number of schools, the distance between schools, and so forth. Essentially, as enrollment increases, the funding for the school board increases as well. And when enrollment declines, funding decreases. The frequently asked questions that will be posted on the website will contain a link to a guide to core education funding for 2024-2025 school year, which will provide you with more details. Next question: how will the 2025-2026 school year budget impact teacher staffing and class sizes? Teacher staffing ratios are determined by the Ontario Ministry of Education and are funded according to those mandated ratios. In the past, under the previous funding model, the HDSB had flexibility as a growth board to allocate additional teachers to the classroom and additional classroom supports beyond the funded ratios. The flexibility is no longer an option, and staffing must align to the funded ratios, leading to increases in kindergarten classes as well as some secondary class sizes. For 2025-2026 school year, no additional changes to staffing or class sizes are expected compared to the current year. However, the HDSB will continue to staff schools efficiently and in compliance with the mandated class sizes. Average class sizes are 26:1 in kindergarten, where the teacher is supported by an early childhood educator, 20:1 for grades 1 to 3, 24.5:1 for grades 4 to 8, and 23:1 for secondary classes. It is important to note that some classes will have lower or higher than average number of students. Why has the budget for instruction expenses per student increased by 7.3% for the 2024-2025 school year? The increase in instructional expenses is largely due to the new labor agreements which were finalized this year. These agreements include retroactive payment for all employee groups, which has a significant increase to costs compared to the previous year. However, this increase is matched by additional revenue to offset the higher expenses. The next question: how is special education funded in the HDSB? Special education funding is provided by the Ministry of Education through enveloped funding. Over the years, the Ontario Ministry of Education has introduced several funding sub-allocations for special education. These include a per pupil allocation based on overall enrollment, differentiated needs allocation, a special education statistical prediction model, and the specialized equipment allocation. These allocations cover staffing costs, professional development, materials, geographic needs, and specialized equipment for students with special needs. The HDSB does not allocate funds based on specific exceptionalities. Resources are allocated based on decisions made through Individualized Program Review Committee, the IPRC placements for self-contained classes, as well as input from special education services staff and school staff. This information helps guide resource allocations to meet the needs of students. Despite the envelope funding, the HDSB consistently overspends the allocation for special education as we prioritize the success for students with special needs. The funding model used by the ministry, which was introduced in 2014-2015, is based on outdated data and has resulted over the years in a loss of $20 million in funding for the HDSB. Although some of the funding model components have been adjusted over time, the allocation continues to use older data and does not reflect the increase in students requiring special education services. The frequently asked questions that we will post on the website will contain a link to the guide to 2024-2025 special education funding for a more detailed overview of special education funding. Related to the previous question, the next question asks, how is the allocation of educational assistance determined? Will there be any reduction in the educational assistance funding in the future? Educational assistants support and provide care for vulnerable students, and the HDSB has prioritized funding to maintain current staffing levels. Any potential increases in the educational assistant allocation will be determined based on stakeholder input and the evaluation of needs and priorities during the budget process. There are no plans to reduce educational assistance funding or allocation for the HDSB, and we remain committed to serving students who require support from educational assistance. What are enveloped funds and how do they affect balancing the budget? Envelope funds are specific amounts of money that are provided by the Ontario Ministry of Education that must be used for a designated purpose. For example, special education funding can only be spent on expenses related to special education programs and services, and capital funding can only be spent on building and infrastructure capital costs. These restrictions limit flexibility in how the overall budget can be allocated. The next question: what are the actual dollar figures for budget pressures and how do they impact the budget? This refers to an infographic that we have available on our budget input page. The budget pressures related to the underfunded areas include $10 million to cover the cost of supply staff that exceed the funding allocation, $4.5 million to cover the cost of special education and student well-being programs and services, $1.7 million to cover student transportation costs, and $1.4 million to cover the temporary accommodations such as portables for those areas that are seeing student growth. Additionally, the funding for learning resources and technology has not been adjusted since 2008, when inflation has increased during that same period by over 40%. This significantly strains our budget in this area. To address these pressures, the HDSB reduces spending in areas such as school operations, maintenance, and board administration. The HDSB also uses additional revenue sources to complement core education funding, such as investment income, international student fees, facility rentals for community use of school, which all help support core education funding and ensure that critical areas are adequately funded. The next question asks if the $1.8 million deficit could be offset by a 0.25% decrease in instruction expenses. The HDSB has been fiscally responsible over the years, accumulating a surplus that provides flexibility to make certain one-time investments to support the budget. In 2024-2025 school year, significant reductions were made to eliminate the structural deficit, totaling over $10 million. To avoid further impacts to the system, the decision was made to use accumulated surplus for the remaining one-time expenses, rather than cutting instruction costs. Both the HDSB board and the ministry approved this approach to use the surplus for one-time items, with the understanding that this is temporary and the deficit should be addressed and eliminated in 2025-2026 school year. Has the provincial government asked school boards to investigate the feasibility of merging the two school boards in Halton? No, the government of Ontario has not requested this of school boards. School board amalgamation is outside of the purview of the HDSB and its budgeting process. It is, however, important to note that school board funding is mainly based on student enrollment, the number, condition, and size of schools, and demographic data. As such, a larger school board will receive more funding to support more students, to maintain more schools. A larger organization will have higher number of transactions, higher licensing costs, larger data to maintain and analyze, and as a result, will have higher support functions and budgets as well. And for our last question, has the HDSB considered using private cleaning services for elementary schools? Contract cleaning services were piloted in the HDSB elementary schools. However, the feedback was not positive from a customer service perspective, and there was little financial impact. As a result, the pilot schools reverted back to QP staffing for cleaning schools. Staffing ratios for custodians are contractually established. The HDSB uses contract cleaning services for secondary schools, where the model is different and it includes these provisions. And with that, I would like to pass it on to Director Ennis for some closing remarks.
As we end our session, I want to once again thank everyone for participating in this important budget process. We know our community cares deeply about the work we do and shares our commitment to ensuring every student in the HDSB is successful. Your insight and input are crucial as we move forward in developing a 2025 to 2026 school year budget that continues providing a quality educational system for students. The success of student learning and achievement is at the heart of everything we do in the HDSB. The collaboration and feedback from students, staff, families, and community members are key as we work towards achieving this goal, and we thank you for helping us to do this. Please visit hdsb.ca to learn more about the budget development process, review frequently asked questions, and provide your input on the 2025-2026 school year budget. We look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.